There we go. Okay, I make it just after 10, so let's get underway. Look, it's wonderful to see a good crowd here. We are hoping to really delve into what the meaning of community is on an online environment. This has emerged as a result of an interdisciplinary group that I'm a part of. I'm in physics, I'm Tristram Alexander, but I work with Professor Monika Bednarek in linguistics, Professor Eduardo Altman in mathematics, and Dr. Olga Boychak in media and communications, and Dr. Andrew Ross, who's in the Sydney education, well, I'm quite sure of your title actually, Andy, but you're working in the secondary education group. But look, before we actually get started with the workshop proper, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we're all meeting, and pay respects to the elders past and present. Look, the University of Sydney sits on the land of the Gadigal of the Eora Nation, but I know we have people joining from across the country. I'm actually tuning in from the land of the Ngunnawal. So wherever we are, I think we are sitting on a heritage of tens of thousands of years of community. So I think it's quite a fitting workshop, actually, looking back at the incredible past that we have in this country. So we have a great lineup. I'm very happy we're lucky. We've got Professor Axel Bruns joining us from QUT. We also have a selection of researchers from across the University of Sydney. And I think we all come with very different perspectives on what community is. So I really hope we can delve into that. Now, before we get started, just a couple of quick housekeeping type things. You'll notice that this workshop is being recorded. If you have any issues with that, please let me know. We can edit it afterwards. We would like to have the recording there to make this available at a later point. The workshop will run with a plenary at the beginning. Axel will speak for around 40 minutes. There's an opportunity to ask questions. You can see here we've got obviously the Zoom chat. There's also a Slido, so you can, if you're more comfortable posting anonymously, you can even upvote there on the Slido hashtag there. And then we have a series of lightning talks, just short 5-minute talks, in which we will see very different perspectives on what community is. And that will be followed by a panel discussion from all the speakers. And we really invite the audience to engage there and ask questions, and maybe present some of your own, or if you have any particular questions or ideas. Hopefully we even have time to explore things which might not be directly covered by any of the other speakers. So I think with that, I will pass it to Monika Bednarek to introduce our plenary speaker, Axel Bruns. Thank you, Monika. And I'll stop sharing.
Thank you, Tristram. And yes, thank you everyone for coming. It's really good to see you all here. So I just want to start by saying that we really appreciate that Axel accepted our invitation to speak at our interdisciplinary workshop today. And it's really a great pleasure to briefly introduce him to you. So Axel Bruns is a professor in the Digital Media Research Centre at Queensland University of Technology in Brisbane. He is very widely known for his work on online media, including, but by no means limited to, social media and Twitter. His research has been highly influential, not only for the new theoretical concepts he has introduced, but also for methodological innovation, especially for analysing big social data. And Axel, of course, has a wide range of publications across the field of online media, and I won't list them all, but I just want to give you a bit of a flavour of his current research interests. So his 3 most recent books are Filter Bubbles Real, published by Polity in 2019, Gate Watching in News Curation, Journalism, Social Media and the Public Sphere, published by Peter Lang in 2018, and he's also co-edited a volume on Digitizing Democracy, that was published by Routledge in 2019. Axel Bruns is also currently a chief investigator on an ARC discovery project on fake news, also a chief investigator in the ARC Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision-Making in Society. And his most recent achievement is a 5-year Australian Laureate Fellowship funded with actually $3.5 million, which was announced earlier this year. And this project is about the drivers and dynamics of partisanship and polarization in online communication. And that continues Axel's interest in concepts such as filter bubbles and echo chambers. And all of these concepts, of course, do intersect with the concept of community. And this is the topic of his talk for us today, called Online Communities and Where to Find Them. conceptual and analytical frameworks. So please join me all in welcoming Axel today.
All right, thank you very much. I hope you can hear me well. It's great to speak to you today. I'm just going to get my slides started and then we can get going. So yes, there's the talk, and this is something slightly different from what I usually present, perhaps by looking more deeply into this idea of communities. But before I get to that, let me also acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands upon which I live and work, the Turrbal and Yagra people, as well as the traditional owners, of course, of the lands from which you are joining. I would like to pay respect to their elders, laws, customs, and creation spirits, and recognize that these unceded lands have always been places of teaching, research, and learning. And of course, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people play an important role within the QUT community and in all of our communities, I think. Also, before I get started, just very quickly, as you may have seen already, I'm currently calling for applications for 4 postdoc jobs on my laureate fellowship. So if anyone is interested, or knows people who are interested, then please pass on the details. You can find full details on my Twitter feed or at bit.ly/laureate team. So it'd be great to hear from people who might be interested in this. All right, so let me get started then. And I'll start here. This is possibly something that some of you might have seen before. This is work that we did a few years back, mapping essentially follower relationships in the Australian Twitter sphere. So we gathered details for nearly 4 million accounts that existed in the Australian Twitter sphere in 2016, gathered their follower connections, their follower relationships, and used standard network mapping approaches to essentially map the clusters that emerged from those relationships. And in some ways, of course, this could be seen as an indication of community. We as we saw this network map, this network structure, we then went in and had a look at the clusters that emerged, tried to work out from the descriptions of the accounts themselves, what they were about, how they described themselves, what they said about themselves, and then we named these clusters through, manual interpretation, basically, of these accounts. And this is what emerged. You can see some very obvious clusters that emerge here, from teen culture all the way through to politics, from sports all the way through to food and drinks, and so on. So that's an approach to, I guess, identifying potentially where there may be communities in the Australian Twitter sphere. But this really depends on what we mean by communities. And that's really what I want to spend some time on. But keep that graph in mind, keep that visualization in mind, because I'll get back to it in a moment as well. Here's another example, again, based on network mapping of some work that we've done quite recently. This is tracking the sharing of links to a long list of about 2,300 suspected fake news domains, problematic information sources on Facebook. So this is from public pages, public groups, public verified profiles that at some point between 2016 and March 2021 shared one or more links to these problematic sites on our list. And we, again, mapped them basically based on how they shared this content, how they interacted with each other, and so on. Now, again, you see some obvious clusters in the network appearing there. And again, we went in and kind of tried to identify, well, what are the most central pages and groups to these clusters? And this is kind of what emerged. There's a cluster there of progressives in the US, of conservatives in the US. There's a few other nation-specific clusters. There's a bunch of more conspiracy and alternative medicine, alternative finance-focused clusters there as well. If we zoom into some of this, you'll see some more definition there as well. So we have this sort of weird spread of clusters there from, alternative food, your Peter Evans type people, basically, through to alternative medicine, to anti-vaxxers, to people who believe that in all sorts of weird causes for autism, all the way through to people who believe in UFOs, and of course, climate change denialists are in there somewhere as well. This again, there are some intersections between these different groups. They interconnect in some way as well. And again, we could think about whether these actually constitute communities or not. what does that mean actually if we describe them as communities rather than just as clusters in the network? So these are some of the key kind of terms that we tend to use, often quite interchangeably, unfortunately, although they really mean some very different things. Communities, audiences, publics, crowds, groups, clusters, of course, I've mentioned as well. So what are they actually? How would we distinguish them here in a more systematic way? That's really what I want to be talking about today, and try to give a more systematic approach, ideally, to these types of groupings, I guess, if I can call them that, that we might observe both in social media as well as elsewhere, of course. This is not limited to social media alone. So in the first place, I've talked about clusters already, and really there is a slippage of terminology, unfortunately, because what in network science, in computer science, often is called community, and you see there a window from Gephi, a very popular network visualization tool, which basically says, well, this is a community algorithm and community detection algorithm that we provide in order to identify these kinds of clusters. But really, I think that's quite problematic, because communities really mean something very specific. And what this algorithm does is to detect clusters in the network. Whether they are ultimately communities is a very different question, and a more complex question than simply identifying nodes in a network that are more connected with each other than with the rest of the network, which is really the fundamental definition of clusters. So as you see there, this particular algorithm that exists in Gephi, calls itself a community detection algorithm. And it then also says, well, if you change the resolution, you can find more or fewer communities, basically more smaller ones or fewer bigger communities in the network. And in fact, here's an example of this. So this is, again, a map of the Australian Twitter sphere with the resolution for community detection, or for cluster detection, really, I should say properly, set at 0.5, which is just some arbitrary number, of course. And you see there within this network, is indicated by the different colors, it has detected a bunch of different, what it calls communities, what really are clusters in the network. And broadly, they seem to map on what we can see visually as well. The kind of blobs that you see in this network basically tend to be colored in different ways. Running the same with a finer resolution, a lower resolution in this case, you see that some of those blobs then subdivide into smaller blobs as well. So what's going on there, I guess, is the obvious question. Which of these are, which is correct, I guess, is perhaps the simple question here. And of course, the answer is neither is any more correct than the other. They simply run at different resolutions and therefore give us different results. You see there the cluster that's sort of at the center top in this visualization is kind of split apart into a number of individual clusters. Whereas in the previous, it was just one big sort of light blue cluster. Now it's divided into 3 or 4 or 5 colors. Neither is more correct than the other. It's simply picking up on finer subdivisions within this cluster. But again, the question is, well, are either or both of these then communities? What are they in a more systematic way? And that's really what I want to get to a little bit more from here on. So let's think about this a bit more. Clusters, as I say, are basically nodes in a network, or more broadly, entities in a collection that are identified in some way by sharing certain properties. That might be based on their connections with each other. So the more densely connected parts of a network might be identified as a cluster in the network, compared to other parts of the network that they're not connecting with so closely, so significantly. But of course, there might also be other aspects here. It could be other attributes as well that we might identify that also enable us to cluster them together, say in their descriptions, say in their posting activities if we're still on social media, or in other attributes that we might identify for any one of these nodes in the network. So we can cluster them on all sorts of bases. And of course, they are ultimately grouped in a reasonably artificial way by an algorithm, sometimes by manual labor, based on the similarities that they have, that may or may not be superficial, that may or may not be particularly profound core attributes. We could cluster them together based on some very basic features as well. And in that case, I think it's certainly not appropriate to talk about them as communities. So how do we find them? And this has sort of been the subtitle, I guess, of this talk. So I'll carry that through all the way. Well, in networks, obviously, as I've said, modularity detection tools, there's plenty out there. In Gephi particularly, there's the Louvain algorithm that's been embedded there. You might, again, cluster by other attributes in other data sets. And as you've just seen, if you select different levels of sensitivity in your cluster detection, you might actually get some very different results. In fact, one of the obvious features that might emerge here is that there's basically a hierarchy of clustering. There's broad superclusters even, then there's clusters, then there's subclusters and sub-subclusters and so on. So larger clusters might break down further and further and further into smaller subclusters if you look at them more closely. And that's, quite a typical feature of these sorts of networks. Of course, the right level of looking at them is very much dependent on what you're trying to find out. If you're interested in the broad structures, then that sort of cluster or supercluster level might be sufficient. If you're interested in finer distinctions within a cluster, then you need to go to the subclusters, sub-subclusters, and so on. So that's clusters. That's basically a very algorithmic, very mathematical approach to identifying entities in your data set that have similar features, whatever those features might be. Let's go beyond that then and really start thinking about more social kind of groupings that aren't simply defined by their technical attributes. And I'll start with this concept of the group, basically. And yeah, you see there that image, that's definitely a group. The way I define them is they're usually small in number. There's not that many people in the group. They're known to each other. These guys are clearly known to each other under their masks, presumably. They have shared interests, values, and aims, tick, although the rebel fighter that's in there might have some slightly different aims from the imperial stormtroopers. And they have fairly stable relationships, maybe also distinct roles in the group. Again, rebel versus imperial or whatever. But not to joke too much about this, this is a fairly typical definition of a group. So how would you find them? Well, you'd find them in a social media context, for instance, because they have strong and repeated and stable interactions with each other. They're clearly not just sort of passing each other by and occasionally exchanging a word, but they are very closely and very strongly connected and maybe share a language, share other identity markers, maybe share the same media objects that they're engaging with, whether that's texts or images or videos or memes or whatever else, again in a social media context, and probably have fairly similar activity patterns as well, because they come together as groups as well. So that's how I would expect to find groups like this. Contrast that and maybe kind of scale this up and you get to communities. Communities are bigger, and again, the image there, I've tried to raid Unsplash for some appropriate images, and I think that's actually quite an appropriate one in this case. So a hive of bees is a community, clearly. It's quite large often. Key members are known to each other. Everyone knows the queen, I guess, and the members of particular work groups might know each other and so on. So that's a community. There is a stronger structure here that involves a center and a periphery, leaders and followers, that has a kind of a clear set of an in-group perhaps that's really ultimately the most influential in that community. They broadly still have shared interests, but those interests might be contestable. People at the periphery of a community might not share all of the interests and values and aims that the people at the center embody. And in fact, your being part of the periphery of a community might result from you not sharing the values of the community all that much. So that's how I would define a community. And then the question again is how to find them. Well, in the first place, again, there will be repeated and stable interconnections and interactions between them. So that's not so different from a group. But we would expect to see some clear leading participants emerging in the data, in our observations of these interactions. That really then results in us identifying central and more peripheral participants. There's a few different ways of approaching this from a more mathematical point of view as well. There are things that, like the 1990 rule, where you've got sort of 1% of really core members who are responsible for most of the content, most of the activities in the group, in the community, sorry. Another 9% of people who are perhaps, still quite heavily engaged, but not as active as the absolute center. And then sort of 90% of people who are really more hangers-on and maybe consuming activity in the group in the community without really getting hugely engaged themselves. There's the Pareto rule as well, which is sort of an 80-20 rule, where kind of 20% of the community is responsible for most of the content, most of the activity. There are distinctions there. So some people then translate this to the central kind of part, the central leaders being the creators, the next group down being the contributors, and then the next group being the lurkers. None of this is set in stone, and obviously the percentages may vary. This is not meant to be an absolute and fixed percentages, but that kind of distribution is quite common. This is essentially what we're talking about, is of course a long tail distribution from the central leading participants to the long tail of hangers-on who might monitor what's going on but aren't hugely engaged. Another tool I've always found useful for really identifying, I guess, the community nature of a grouping I might have identified, of a cluster I might have seen, is to apply the EI index as well, which basically compares the interactions with the outside of that cluster to the interactions with the inside of that cluster. And that is, if that index basically is very strongly weighted to internal interactions, then you've got a sign that there is a strong sort of sense of community and community engagement going on. If people largely engage, obviously, with people on the outside of that cluster, well, then the cluster doesn't have much of a life of its own, basically. So that's also quite a useful measure ultimately of the communal nature, the community features of what you might have identified as a cluster. I have links, by the way, in all of this, and I'm happy to share the PowerPoint, of course, afterwards too. And again, in communities, it's still true that there is kind of a broadly shared language. There are shared identity markers, shared media objects, and so on. So that's still carried over from what groups are, but it really just scales up to a much higher level, and that means more internal structure to keep the community going as well. Let's then move on to a looser kind of grouping, the crowd. And look, I mean, I've used the image here of the umbrella revolution in Hong Kong. It's clearly a crowd. We could possibly define this as a public as well, and I'll get to that in a moment as well. But let's just, describe it as a crowd for the moment. A crowd is still larger than a community, I would say, and much less knowable ultimately. The participants in a crowd are joined together in some form. They have maybe a shared identity, shared interest. The people here in this image have a shared interest in democracy, which is being denied to them. But obviously, they may not share a whole lot of other things together. They're here for a particular purpose. They share a particular desire, but otherwise they might be quite diverse and quite different from each other as well, from different walks of life and so on. Crowds also tend to be more transient, more temporary. As they are here, they're gathered in one space, obviously, for a demonstration, for a very large demonstration, but they're not necessarily then connected and engaged with each other all the time. They're not always together all the way through. So this is a much more temporary formation, ultimately, that can be quite powerful, of course, but is, again, more temporary and more transient. So finding them, well, you'd find them usually because there's quite a large number of them, of participants in them. They might also show up because they're very, very active for a fairly limited period of time, maybe because they're connected to particular defined issues. So you might find them because some keyword, some hashtag, something else is kind of spiking in your data for a brief period of time. And that would identify perhaps a crowd. They have, of course, for that temporary period, some very similar activity patterns. They might all obviously gather in the same space online, offline, or even online. They might all perhaps use some of the same markers of identity, whether that's the language that they're using, the media objects that they're sharing, the hashtags that they're using, for instance, which is one type of media object. or memes or anything else. So that's how you would identify this kind of crowd behavior for a brief period of time, and then presumably it dissipates again until possibly that crowd comes together again for the next demonstration and the next protest or the next activity more broadly that they might be engaging in. And there is a kind of a strong overlap there with the idea of a public as well. Publics, and again, the image here, I could have flipped the two around and they might still have worked. Here in the image you see obviously a Black Lives Matter demonstration. So that's a kind of a very similar kind of concept perhaps, but publics, in my view, are more centered around that shared interest, shared issue, maybe a shared text as well. In the Black Lives Matter case, online, for instance, the Black Lives Matter hashtag, for instance, they too form and dissolve fairly rapidly. And my colleague Jean Burgess and I have described this as ad hoc publics, particularly in an online context. We might also talk about issue publics, and that's a term that Jürgen Habermas has used in the more recent past. So publics that form around a particular issue, and this certainly applies to Black Lives Matter, I think. Publics tend to be more aware of each other and communicate more publicly, and that's why this image is perhaps useful, because there's clearly communication going on, though it is at this point reasonably one way possibly. And through that communication might also be more active in developing shared values, maybe a shared language as well. And again, I think that could be said of the Black Lives Matter protests and movement. They are ultimately, I think, more capable than a crowd of organizing in support of a common goal as well. And again, I mean, without wanting to be too down on the umbrella revolution in Hong Kong, that might be what distinguishes it and the crowds that gathered for it from the Black Lives Matter movement, which arguably has been more impactful, although it's also faced possibly a weaker enemy ultimately that was willing to negotiate. So that is, to me, the distinction between a public and a crowd more generally. Publics just are more impactful ultimately, and perhaps have a longer impact, a longer legacy than crowds do. So again, similar kind of ways of finding them. They might have some very large numbers of participants, obviously. Again, you might identify them by the strong activity that they show around particular issues as well. But also, I think what distinguishes them from crowds then is more interaction between participants, possibly a stronger shared language, and a stronger sense of shared values that may also finally lead into actually community formation ultimately, the emergence of leaders, of structures that turn publics into communities that pursue an issue for much longer than a public can. And that, again, arguably is something that we might have seen happen with the Black Lives Matter movement that didn't quite happen in the same way against much harder opposition with the Umbrella Revolution as well. And then I think finally, there's the concept of audiences as well. Audiences are, again, not dissimilar from the last two concepts I've talked about, but much more centrally centered around a shared media text or a shared text. I mean, in this case, it's still a media text. The people at a concert, but it's a live text, obviously. In this case, it's a live performance, whereas other media texts might be, Netflix series for all I know, or other kinds of shared texts that a large grouping of consumers, of viewers ultimately gather around. So these can also be very large, of course, but they're much more dispersed, and they tend not to be so aware of each other, because they're all essentially their primary engagement is with the central text, not with each other, and therefore also they're not really forming much in terms of shared values, shared interests, shared identities beyond the central interest, of course, that they've got. So they're all fans of a particular thing, for instance, but beyond that, there is not necessarily much going on that connects them. And because they're not really connected with each other, they're not really engaging with each other, they're broadly incapable of really acting together in some form. Of course, sometimes audiences become communities, fan communities, for instance. in the recent past, we've just seen this, for instance, with the debate around whether or not the new season of Star Trek Discovery will be streamed at the same time in Australia as it will be elsewhere. So in some ways, there is an audience around the Star Trek Discovery series, but there is also, of course, a community of Trekkies who've taken this on and really pushed that argument forward and seem to have convinced Paramount Plus of streaming things earlier than they were going to. So that's a transition from an audience to a community perhaps, or in fact, a community around which there is a broader audience that isn't as active as the kind of core Trekkies are. So yeah, again, they're unified obviously by that central text, and that's really how to find them. They're kind of connecting with that central media object ultimately. They may be of very different sizes. There might be niche audiences to very large mass media audiences. Largely they're kind of observing the content rather than actively contributing. And of course, therefore, they're just far less visible to each other. They don't really see and know each other unless they move beyond simply being audience members towards being perhaps a public or a community. And because of that, of course, there is that long-standing idea of the imagined audience, of the imagined kind of group that you're part of as you're consuming a particular media object. Which makes you far less traceable usually than people who are actively engaging and actively voicing their fandom or participation in some form. So these are kind of the broad concepts, I guess, I wanted to introduce. One obvious question that I very often get, and unfortunately that is not necessarily always very well answered in the literature either, is, well, what are hashtags in all of this? Are they communities? Are they hashtag communities? Are they hashtag publics? What are they? Well, there can be any of these things ultimately. You could simply be part of an audience if you're following a hashtag, let's say, a match hashtag, a sporting hashtag, essentially. You might just be following the updates from the match by following the hashtag itself. You might be part of a crowd if you're posting into the hashtag, but not necessarily following it. And for most people, that's a hashtag like Auspol for Australian politics. Lots of people use it. Only a much smaller group of people actually actively follow it and really engage in it. You might be part of a public if those hashtags are used to coordinate public action. Again, I've talked about Black Lives Matter, Me Too is another example. And of course, there are much smaller publics as well that exist around more specific issues and activities. You might be part of a community if you're actually really engaging with others who are using that hashtag. So for some people, that is Auspol. So Auspol can be both the crowd and community, depending on who you're looking at and who these people are who are engaging. Of course, you might also be part of a smaller crowd. One of the best examples in Australia is ActChatAus, the hashtag for farmers and environmentalists and others to come together quite regularly to talk about agricultural policy and developments and the weather and everything else. So there is a strong sense of shared identity, and they have regular meetups and so on. So that's a much more of a group sense rather than a community, I would say. And of course, all of them ultimately are clusters. If you were looking at them from a network perspective, they will show up as clusters in some form. But that, again, doesn't translate into them being communities as such. They could be any of these things. So not every hashtag, and that's really the core thing I'd want to be saying here, is not every hashtag is a community. And we really have to get away, and particularly, sorry to say, those of you who are perhaps in computer science and related disciplines where the term community is frankly overused and misused, should really be careful with that term and really talk about clusters rather than communities, because otherwise there are lots of misunderstandings with people from other disciplines. And I guess just as a final part of this talk, if I can, I do want to say a little bit here about the public sphere as well, because that's obviously a term that does pop up quite frequently with all of this as well. The idea of the public sphere, of course, comes from Jürgen Habermas, who's been writing about this since, well, the 1960s, I'd say, at least. He describes it in one of the major recent outputs as mediated political communication carried on by an elite on a virtual stage of mediated communication. What that really describes ultimately isn't so much the reality of, today's media, but it really describes the reality of, well, I'd say German television of the 1960s and 70s, and that's the image that I'm showing you there. During that time, you had regularly 80% of the viewing public switching on at 8 p.m. to watch the Tagesschau, the main news broadcast. So that really was a case of mediated political communication carried on by an elite, the journalists and the politicians being interviewed on a virtual stage of this daily TV news bulletin. But I don't think, unfortunately, that this concept really translates all that well anymore into the much more complex and diverse environment that we are now living in, for better or for worse. So we've got to really start to think about, well, what does the public sphere look like today? Now, for more than a decade now, I've been kind of operating with this image in my mind, essentially, of what the public sphere looks like, what the public sphere looks like, which is really to say there is no longer one kind of central public sphere that we're all part of, but lots of publics that intersect in various ways. So there is still, of course, mainstream media at the center of a lot of this, and mainstream media still have a very large audience. But in addition to that, you've also got niche media outlets that exist much further to the periphery and have much smaller and more bespoke and more specialist audiences. You've got publics, communities, other forms of groupings, as I've talked about, that exist, that form and dissolve, particularly via social media spaces, but also online, also offline and in other online spaces. So these different groupings still, have a really growing role to play ultimately in the public sphere, in what the public sphere used to be. And of course, outside of these groupings, you've got a lot of everyday communication as well. Just the interactions that we have with each other, both online and offline every day. What Habermas calls the wild flows of communication in one of his more evocative formulations. And I think there's actually, there's simply more of that, or there's more space for that and more visibility for that, because so much of it has now moved into online space, into more public, more visible spaces. So we see much more of it if we look at Facebook and Twitter and other social media platforms, for instance. So there's a lot of these different kind of groupings, these different clusters, these different bits of public communication that exist online and offline, for that matter. And so the public sphere is kind of fragmented into all of these different spaces, particularly, of course, in an online environment. So online, we've got publics and crowds and all the other things that might be, just fairly short-lived, that might exist and will form and dissolve around particular issues and events and so on. They're quite limited in some ways in their focus. They're very concentrated, I guess, is a more positive way of saying it, on particular things. And when we move on from these things, then they disappear again. There's perhaps something a bit broader there, and some people have described this as public spherals or sphericals. And that might be more persistent and more stable kind of groupings that might include from time to time these publics, or might overlap at least with these publics that are more short-lived. So they're longer term and more persistent themes and topics that are being addressed here, that might have a broader scope, but still have a unifying theme, and of course maybe more structure in the participant communities as well. And some of that, you can go back to the early 2000s to Stuart Cunningham's work, which describes this, I think, quite well, and really talks about this well before really the advent of social media in the way that we know them now. So there's again quite a history already of this. Some people have also talked about public spheres in the plural, that might be around particular domains, identities, platforms. So obviously we've talked, we use the term Twitter sphere, and we could see this as a platform-specific public sphere, possibly. There are indigenous and political public spheres and so on that people have described as well. So these are much more persistent. They really encompass all of what I've talked about here, the publics, the crowds, the groups, the communities, and all of that, and perhaps are more broadly domain or identity-centered or possibly platform-centered as well. And then there is a question of whether the public sphere, is still useful as a concept, essentially, to encompass all of that. It could be described perhaps as the sum total of all of these smaller parts that overlap and intersect and engage with each other in some form. But it no longer can be described as this sort of mediated arena for public debate that's just carried out in front of mass audiences by elites. I think we've moved well beyond that, and everyone else is very much talking now as well. And I've got a chapter actually in the book that Monica mentioned earlier, Digitizing Democracy, that that kind of tries to work through these concepts and different public spheres, different publics, different formations of interaction and communication in the online world in Australia. So that's all I wanted to say. Thank you very much, and I hope we have a bit of time for discussion and then the lightning talks as well. And just very briefly, I'd like to acknowledge, obviously, the various projects that have supported all of this in various forms, and the various process of data gathering and analysis as well. So thank you all very much. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Axel. I think we all join in a big clap. That was a wonderful plenary talk and a beautiful overview. I think perfect for this workshop, actually setting the scene of all the different formulations.